Welcome to this webinar on innovation brought to you by the Qatar Research Development and Innovation Council, or QRDI for short. My name is Francis Yeo. I'm a senior advisor to the council and a professor for entrepreneurship at the National University of Singapore. And I'm privileged to be able to moderate today's webinar. For those who are not familiar, let me say a few words about QRDI first. The Qatar Research Development and Innovation Council was set up a few years ago with the mission to develop the R&D and innovation ecosystem in Qatar. QRDI manages the Qatar National Research Fund, or QNRF, which provides grants for scientific research and also supports training and innovation projects for both large and small enterprises in Qatar. This seminar series was created to be a conversation platform for discussing current topics in research, development, and innovation, or RDI, across the world. It brings together policymakers, research and innovation funding agencies, academics, entrepreneurs, and industry experts to share their experiences and insight about important issues which impact the RDI ecosystem and, where relevant, how this relates to Qatar's own innovation ecosystem. The topic today is education, research, and service, now startups too. And the subtext is about how important is the role of universities in developing tech entrepreneurs and building startups. I'm greatly honored and delighted to have a truly excellent panel of experts to share their views on this interesting topic. So let me introduce each panelist briefly. First, we have Professor Dame Fiona Murray, Professor of Entrepreneurship at MIT. She's Director of MIT's Office of Innovation and Faculty Director of the MIT Legatum Center for Entrepreneurship and Development. Among her numerous global advisory roles, Professor Murray serves on the British Prime Minister's Council on Science and Technology and is a member of the Ministry of Defense Innovation Advisory Panel and the European Innovation Council Joint Expert Group. Professor Murray also leads the MIT Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program, or REAP, through which she has engaged many global regions in designing policies and programs for innovation ecosystems across the UK, Europe, and the Middle East as well. So, Professor Murray or Fiona, thank you very much for taking time to join the discussion from Boston, where it is early morning.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, next, crossing over to the Atlantic from Boston, we are pleased to have Mr. Ben Mumby-Croft, Director of Entrepreneurship at Imperial College London. Ben is an award-winning enterprise educator with more than 15 years experience supporting university entrepreneurs and comes from a background in creative marketing, communications, and branding. As director of Imperial Enterprise Lab, Ben leads the team responsible for delivering a range of extracurricular support programs and services for entrepreneurs, students, graduates, and postdocs, as well as the incubation services team and the team responsible for running the UK's leading MedTech accelerator program called the MedTech Super Connector. And before Imperial College, Ben has also led enterprise education teams in Oxford, Cambridge, and the City University of London. So Ben, we are delighted to have you join us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And finally, coming back to the Middle East, we welcome Dr. Lotfi Belkir, Associate Director for Entrepreneurial Transformation at Qatar University, the largest university in the country. Lotfi is a physicist, inventor, entrepreneur, and scholar. He and his team are responsible for training the university community in innovation, entrepreneurship, and technology commercialization. Before joining Qatar University, Lotfi was professor and chair of eco-entrepreneurship at McMaster University in Canada, responsible for the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Program, which received the Excellence in Entrepreneurship Award from the International Council of Small Businesses and Entrepreneurship. And before joining academia, Lotfi was a founder and CEO of Curtas Technologies, the maker of the world's first and fastest automatic book scanner. So welcome, Lotfi, and pleased to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Okay, maybe a quick word about myself. I'm a professor for entrepreneurship at the National University of Singapore, teaching entrepreneurship classes for the last 20 years. My last full-time job was in the Prime Minister's office in Singapore, where I developed national policies and programs for Singapore's innovation ecosystem. And before that, I was running an internet startup. Okay, well, I'm sure you'll agree with me that we do have a truly distinguished panel of global experts to discuss tonight's topic. Right? And in fact, we're operating across 4 time zones. Fiona in Boston, Ben in London, I suppose. In London, right?
Oxford, but close enough.
Oxford, oh, okay. So Ben is in Oxford. Lotfi in Doha, and myself calling from Singapore, where it is almost it's past 9 p.m. Okay, so okay, let's get started. How important is the role of universities in developing tech entrepreneurs and building startups? Most universities have a threefold mission, right? I think we're all aware: teaching, research, service. Now, increasingly, universities are also stepping up their efforts in entrepreneurship and producing startups. So how important is this role vis-a-vis the traditional mission of teaching, research, and service? So we'll have a very simple flow for the discussion. I will invite each panelist to respond to this question. How important is this? Briefly, because we have time to go into details later. Briefly first, and then maybe spend up to 10 minutes to share what their respective university is doing in terms of entrepreneurship education or entrepreneurship programs. Okay, so we'll get to see broadly, what is happening across at MIT, at Imperial College, in Qatar University. Maybe I'll add a little bit about what's happening in Singapore and US as well. And then we'll ask some questions to get the conversation going. You're welcome to post questions. In fact, I hope you post lots of questions. You can post the questions to individual panelists or to the entire panel by clicking on the box that says Q&A and typing in your question. Okay, that's it. So let's get started with Fiona first. So how important is the role of universities in developing tech entrepreneurs? What's the view from MIT? Fiona.
Sure. So Francis, just to make sure I understand the rules, do you want me to answer that question and then I will hold off on telling you what we're doing on campus? Is that the easiest thing to do?
Yes. Okay. No, I don't want us to go too deep because I think we want to.
Yeah, that's what I just wanted to make sure. So look, I think it's very difficult to sit at MIT and think we shouldn't be thinking about startups. I mean, it has been, I think, very much a part of what the Institute has done for many, many years. I think you can trace back our role in helping generate startups, certainly to before World War II, and even earlier. A lot of that, I think, comes from the fact that our founding mission, just recall the university is reasonably new, founded in 1861. It was founded in 1861 during a quite tumultuous time in New England, and at a time when the Industrial Revolution was sort of taking hold across the United States. And it was founded to support some of that work. And it was founded with a motto, mens et manus, mind and hand, so sort of being very practical. So I think that the interpretation of that was always that in teaching, in research, and in service, some of what we were teaching about was new industries and the emergence of new solutions to big problems. In research, we were trying to generate those solutions. And in service, we were working, at least in part, in service to the wider economy and to the wider world. And that has always been interpreted, I think, as saying that means a quite deep engagement with industry, with government, and with the major problems and challenges of the day. The thing that I would say has been the shift, if you like, on campus that I've observed in the last 20 years is to sort of separate out, or to at least recognize that there are two types of startup activity that we probably need to support. and that those two types need support in subtly different but complementary ways. And those two types for me are what I would call dorm-based and lab-based. So dorm-based, I have this sort of vision of students lying in bed at night, coming up with ideas, having their own aha moments. And we need to be able to support that. And that is the sort of mental image I think we have of Mark Zuckerberg, creating Facebook, or on our campus, Drew Houston as an undergraduate creating Dropbox, or my MBA student Freddie creating Okta, right? So these are ideas that students have, and we want to be able to support them in having their own ideas, in building startups and incubating those things, giving them the skills and knowledge, or frankly, giving them the skills and knowledge so that when they graduate as alumni at any point in their careers, they can become entrepreneurs. But I think we've also seen the rise of this other piece, this lab-based, meaning more traditional university spin-out. So saying the fruits of our research could be the foundation for startup companies. And so the companies that we might think about, whether it be iRobot or Akamai or Bose or Qualcomm, are companies whose foundations have been in the lab and with technology. And I think our recognition is that it's actually not enough to just help those lab-based companies by licensing, but we also have to wrap around the kind of support for the individuals, the education for PhD students and postdocs, the role of faculty. So I think that is the big shift, is a shift to saying we need to support dorm-based and lab-based. For us, it's probably less controversial than it is on many universities I work with. I think that is because of our founding mission, but it's also something that I think is profoundly important to the economies that we are part of, both locally, regionally, and around the world. So it's not without its complexities. It's not cheap. It takes time. But I think those two flavors of entrepreneurship are things that we need to support. Thanks.
Thank you, Fiona. So let's hear from Ben next. Ben worked in many of the top universities in the UK, right, on entrepreneurship education. So what's your view?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I definitely, I've not heard dorm-based and lab-based, but that's a great sort of characterization. I mean, it used to be in the UK, sort of, if I think to when I first started out in my career, that entrepreneurship and innovation in universities was what happened in the sort of commercialization office or in the tech transfer office. So it's all about lab-based research, and it was about sort of getting patents, doing long, complicated negotiation processes to either protect IP that we could license to industry or form a sort of spin out. And then sort of around about 20 years ago, particularly in the UK, further back in the US, you get the rise of the sort of the dorm-based entrepreneur. And I think certainly driven by a number of things, the whole Zuckerberg, you could create a sort of $1 billion startup in your dorm room. The financial crisis really kind of gave a sort of second wind, or you had the kind of second coming of entrepreneurship at universities, which was much more sort of student focused. And that's really been, I don't think I would have, in terms of my experience, I don't think I would have sort of prospered in kind of the traditional TTO kind of office or the technology transfer office, but certainly in the realm of helping students, that's been where my career's been based. I think that if, going back to your question, I mean, what's the mission or what's the role of a university? So yes, education, research, but also impact, right? It's also about the research we generate, the ideas we generate, we actually want them to be of value to society. Yeah. It's not just enough to have, the Wall Citadel to have this amazing research, and we actually want to have an impact. And I think that certainly drives our students. Our students they want to get a fantastic degree, but they want to have agency. They want to know that they're going to, that they're able to go out into the world and take an idea and do something with it. And that's kind of, so we tend to think of entrepreneurship as it's all about business and commercial, but fundamentally the way we see it's about how you take something new, how it's whether or not be an idea or a piece of IP, and how you actually bring it to life, how you bring it to reality, how you go from 0 to 1, to use the Peter Thiel, how you go from just a glimmer of something to actually something which generates real value. And not just value in the commercial sense, value in the societal, in the cultural, in the environmental sense. I think it's definitely, what's interesting is, so I think all universities, particularly in the UK, they all see the value in this, but you still have this stark dividing line between teams that do dorm-based and teams that do sort of lab-based entrepreneurship. And that's quite interesting. So kind of entrepreneurship happens in these two buckets. I think Imperial was like probably founded, I mean, uniquely in context. I think we probably founded after MIT. But what's interesting is the founding charter. It's not quite as eloquent, I think, as the sort of MIT motto, but it's got some line which is around, the most advanced training and research in various branches of science, especially in its application to industry. So I do think that there is something about, particularly, it's a science and technology university, but it's in the founding charter. It's not just about world-leading research; it's about how we actually transfer that out of the academic citadel and into the real world. So I think it goes to the core of our mission.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, another term that is used, I think what you call lab-based. I think over here in Singapore, and maybe in other parts also, we call deep tech, right? Deep tech startups, which means that it is not e-commerce, social network kind of business ideas, but actually
deep tech is a new buzzword.
Yeah,
it's a buzzword. Yeah, it's a deep tech, so it usually comes from extensive research. Okay, let's hear from Lotfi. Lotfi, I think QU is probably a little newer than the MIT and Imperial in doing entrepreneurship. So can you tell us what's QU's view, and also what has QU done?
Well, thanks. Well, I would say that QU is perhaps in the tradition of Qatar, trying always to punch above its weight. It's actually taken this a step further and stating that the university central role is really the advancement of societal growth, whether economic or societal or environmental, and that the university is here to be the core engine for that advancement. And if we look at the university model, in fact, why are we specialized today in those faculties and departments and subspecialization? It's really because of, in a way, we can trace that back to Adam Smith's book on the Wealth of Nations, where his main argument about advancement of economic growth is through specialization. And that was the main, really, argument of his book. It took universities about 150 years later. And in fact, the university did not used to be specialized. They used to be very general. And it was not until 1920, which was about 150 years after the publication of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, that universities started responding to this need of specialization, mostly in engineering and medicine and other sciences and arts, and started creating these faculties and colleges and departments and so on. But with the emergence of the information age, we're starting to see the specialization trend running out of steam. And so, and where innovation is coming from entrepreneurs and tech entrepreneurs especially, and economic growth and creation of new jobs is mostly coming from startups, not from the established companies. And so, and where now the tech entrepreneur is never almost a specialist. You'll see that it's somebody who's very kind of multi-versed, is very multidisciplinary. Very often the opportunities and the major problems that we face, like climate change or others, or the solutions that we see emerging, combines hardware, software, business skills, and so on, all in one person or in one team. And so it's really the return of universities to their core mission, which is the advancement of economic and societal growth, to start really making innovation, entrepreneurship, and cross-disciplinary or transdisciplinary training as part of their core mission. And so Qatar University looks at innovation not in terms of tech-driven versus lab-driven, but rather really as a holistic way of creating value in the society. And that sometimes is IP-driven or deep tech. Sometimes it's business model-driven. Sometimes it's market-driven. And we really don't care as long as that innovation happens, that creation of value happens. And we've essentially made sustainable socioeconomic or sustainable economic impact as a third pillar or a fourth pillar, if you wish, next to teaching, research, and service And we're essentially targeting the whole university community, whether it's the students or the faculties or the researchers and even the staff. And we're approaching it as really a holistic approach where we're not focusing only on the founders, but we're focusing also on training the talent that is going to be able to work in this entrepreneurial society and economy, rather than be specialized and be narrowly essentially competent in only one specialty, because we see that does not really help solve those major and complex challenges.
Okay, thank you, Lotfi. Well, I think we didn't get to talk a bit about the kinds of things that are done under entrepreneurship. I had a look at Imperial College website, and I was amazed at the number of things that are going on. And of course, MIT, there's just so many programs going on at the same time. I wonder, you've all been involved in entrepreneurship activities for so many years. Among the kind of programs, right, the myriad of programs that are being offered over the years, do you see any that you think has got some offers the kind of best effectiveness, or it's the most effective in achieving the goal of creating companies that gives impact, whether economically or societal good?
Are you asking me?
Anyone?
I'll let Fiona go first. Go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Look, as an institute that probably has, on last count, 50 or so programs and activities, it's really difficult to pick one in particular without fear of offending. If there are 50, then I'm going to offend 49 people. It's also fair to say, I think that if we were starting from scratch, we probably wouldn't do it in quite such a piecemeal fashion. And so it's with some amount of both sort of respect and sort of envy that I look across my screen at Lofty, who has a sort of clean sheet of paper. And I will say that I actually agree with you with respect to saying, so I have found the dorm-based, lab-based distinction to be helpful in helping us sort out at any given moment in time who we are trying to support, but also recognize that at the end of the day, for any of the big problems that we need to solve, what we need to do is bring together teams of humans that, for some of our big problems, we do need very deeply complex technical solutions, but those solutions have to be matched up with the right techno-economics, with the right ability to talk to customers, with the right business model. And so I think in the ideal world, we will have teams of people with different skill sets between PhDs and the business school students, faculty, and external advisors. And so I have also recognized, and I think we increasingly recognize, that the thing that does galvanize our community around entrepreneurship is entrepreneurship in the service of some of the world's most significant challenges. And I think we pride ourselves on paying attention to that and sort of hope that our students don't just develop another dance app, right? Or I always laugh about, if you leave the students to their own devices, you get one too many wine tasting app or Tinder for cats. And we don't really need that. We need people to solve really big problems. And that often requires this combination of sort of business and deep technical kind of creativity put together. If I was to pick a program, and I would say that on the student side, and the sort of dorm-based, I think we have often focused that on our MBA students, and I think we have a long storied history of doing that. There was a real recognition that our undergraduates were an important part of this as well. And our Sandbox program is a program that gives our undergraduate students the opportunity to get small amounts of money that they can spend on pursuing their idea, but they wrap a lot of mentorship around that. And that has been, I think, a powerful thing. And we have new space in which that sort of to try and build that community. On the more lab-based side of things, I would just want to echo Ben's comment that I think it used to be that we would look at the technology transfer office and think it was their job. We see them as basically, if they can reduce the transactional frictions, we are very happy. And Leslie, who leads that office, does an extraordinary job of that. But in fact, to be successful, we know that we need funding, because deep tech, as you know, Francis, is extremely expensive. We need infrastructure so that people can really scale their ideas and use, close to kind of real world scale fabs and other things. And we need some pretty specialized sort of education. And so 5 years ago, MIT created something called the Engine. The Engine is an investment fund focused on, much longer time horizons that are typically more characteristic in the sort of lab-based deep tech activities, but also focuses very hard on making sure that even when those startups leave, they have access back to some of our infrastructure. And finally, focusing on building that community. And so having educational programs with MIT and elsewhere focused on how we make sure that PhDs and postdocs also understand some of the entrepreneurial opportunities to take leadership roles in these companies, not necessarily become faculty, but sometimes go join these companies. And so programs like Blueprint. So the Engine is a new experiment. It's only 5 years old. It's a fund, but it has a number of these other elements. And it's also co-located a number of these ventures in a space just next to campus. So I think to give it the Imperial analogy, it has a little bit of the White City kind of flavor to it. We're fortunate that it doesn't take quite so long to get there, but in the very cold, it feels like a lifetime to walk from one building to another. But it has a fund. The investments are made entirely separately and across lots of university spinouts. But it's trying to build that community of deep tech founders, many of whom have PhDs, and bring them together with really fantastic teams. That's a new experiment that I would really hold up as something really important for us, that we think is a big part of the next steps for us.
Okay, thank you, Fiona. This Engine, that's a venture fund, right? So it's raised, the money is raised from the normal LPs.
That's right. So it's a venture fund. MIT helped kind of imagine it, create it. Normal LP, although it has a much longer time horizon. So it's more like a 14 to 17 year fund. It also has the unique, I think, proposition of having significant space to co-locate those and other founders on a similar journey, and to really emphasize both the sort of education and community building of those special deep tech founders, along with the access to really quite specialized infrastructure. So wet labs and machine shops and fab labs and so on, all kind of co-located.
Interesting, yeah.
If I were to go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, okay. Love to hear since
I would just maybe quickly present what we're doing here at Qatar University. So it's also an experiment, but it's an experiment that's based on the synthesis of a lot of my own personal experience, as well as the experience of of a lot of schools and universities in the United States, and mostly also the program of the I-Corps that was funded by the National Science Foundation. And essentially it's to develop a comprehensive ecosystem where the human capital development is front and center. And because as an education institution, we're here to develop that human capital first. And the main thing that comes around that human capital, it's a lot of things, but funding is not the first one. Yes, funding is important, but the first really thing is what universities do best, which is education and training. But the right kind of education, the right kind of training that's based essentially on that many, many years and many people's experience on what it takes to train an eco-entrepreneur. Because an eco-entrepreneur is not your typical entrepreneur that's a lifestyle business. It's a very complex animal, if I may say. And we've also developed a framework, which we call the Universal Innovation Framework. Again, that's a synthesis of a lot of the entrepreneurial models, the agile or the lean startup model, but it goes beyond that in terms of considering a startup really like a baby that goes through several stages of development, through the gestation, the incubation of the early childhood, and then the teenage years until adulthood, and treat that and provide the training, the funding, the support, and even the emotional support for those, for that child or that baby during the time they need it the most. and treat that really as a living organism that's going through several stages, and for which each stage needs a whole ecosystem and a comprehensive set of funding, support, training, and what have you, that's appropriate to the particular stage of development. And we've essentially launched that. It's an experiment. It's been a year since we launched this whole comprehensive system. It does involve funding. But what's interesting about funding is that the most successful startups that we have so far have barely used half of the funding that's appropriate to them, that's actually been allocated to them. And even though they started by saying, just give me the money and I'll run with it, to realizing that we don't need that much money. We need a lot more different support and training and coaching. What we also found as the university is that the university has a lot of unused capacity of resources that are tremendous and that are available essentially for free for those startups. So we've made a concerted effort to make all those resources, whether the latest electron microscope or some of the latest labs and equipment, and Qatar University owns some of the latest equipment and the resources that we have freely available for those entrepreneurs. And then you have the whole all the faculties, all the researchers, all the students, the graduate students, the postdocs that are part of those resources that sometimes also are happy to join in and essentially participate in that journey. So it's that whole comprehensive ecosystem and training programs that's stage-based and phase and gate-based that we are started implementing. We've seen some very encouraging results so far. 5 of our early teams have now registered as a company. They're starting to see some sales and some market traction. And some of them are IP-based, some of them not so much. And what we also have seen is that the interest from the faculties and the researchers has been tremendous. Whereas initially we thought most of the energy is going to come from the student, but we've seen an extremely interest, enthusiasm, and intake by the faculties and the researchers as well, because I believe we have created that ecosystem in which they can do both. They don't have to give up their jobs in order to join the startup, and they can essentially build their startup while continuing to acquit themselves from their duties as faculty and researchers.
Okay, thank you. Alfie, Ben?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there's a lot of innovation theatre when it comes to sort of entrepreneurship at universities. So, we're going to run a competition and we've got a big prize fund and, a couple of teams are going to win. And I also have to sort of say to our team, and programs like that can be super useful, but we also have to remind our teams that, winning a competition does not mean you have a successful startup. It does not mean you're an entrepreneur. You've literally just won a competition. And the ultimate arbiter of whether or not this idea is a good idea, whether or not it's a scalable idea, is are there people out there who understand it, more importantly, are prepared to pay money for it? And can you deliver that at a profit? So that's always the thing that you have to bear in mind. I think that so what I found, particularly being at Imperial, and particularly having so many different overlapping programs and activities, is it really does take an ecosystem to raise a startup. And often what we'll see is that the more successful teams, be they research-based or sort of student-based, will almost kind of do a couple of orbits of a couple of different competitions or programs. So they'll do one competition, then they might go and do like the Greenhouse Accelerator in a different part of Imperial, then they'll do it. So it's kind of like what I find really useful is basically you provide a number of different platforms. So for those teams who are genuinely committed, once they finish one program, it's very rare that the entrepreneurial journey is like, so that runs completely overlapping with your 6-month program. Like you start here and then often it's going to take 18, 24 months, even longer. So it's kind of having a number of different programs that sort of startups can go through. So Fiona mentioned the sort of sandbox program. I think that's a really cool program. And I think the traditional model is, to the victor, the spoils. Like we're going to try and predict who's going to be the best startup. And if you can pitch really well, then you'll get loads of money at the end. Whereas I think actually a much better way of developing entrepreneurs innovators is where you kind of go, well, look, there's loads of stuff you've got to figure out here. You don't know all the answers. So here's a small amount of money. Go out and run an experiment, test. And then if that goes well, brilliant. Here's a bit more money. If it doesn't go well, no major drama. You've only lost a small amount of money. So I do like that sort of concept of sort of hypothesis-driven experiential learning, like employing more of that kind of experimental mindset. How do we de-risk the idea? I think in terms of two programs that I will call out, and I'm kind of quite conscious in the same sense of Fiona. So the We Innovate program, so Imperial, I think, so over 8 years ago, we set up one of the UK's first entrepreneurship programs for women-led startups. So there's a huge amount of sort of coverage in the press around how, there just isn't the diversity we need. And even when we do get these amazing sort of female founders, that they're just not getting access to the funding they need. So that's been a really fantastic program. And I think on the lab-based side, there's a new program, sort of very much in its early stages of iteration, called DT Prime, or Deep Tech Prime, by a colleague of mine, Ramana Nanda, at the business school. And that's looking at how you sort of take academics and how you, so not just in terms of how academics develop the technology and the research in a way that addresses key commercial concerns. So thinking about what are the experiments we can run? What do we need to demonstrate from a commercial point of view to de-risk the technology from the point of view of potential investors or industry partners? So those are two key programs. But I think overall, there seems to be a move much more towards this kind of, we don't know. It's very difficult to predict the future. I don't know which teams are going to succeed. It's better off to back lots of teams with small amounts of funding and lots of like one-to-one support. And then, that's that. Out of that, you will see some really successful startups.
Yeah. Can I just underscore? I think that's exactly right. And I think, Lofty, you also talked about, milestones and stages of life. And I think that real recognition that you can't just either, a semester is a very arbitrary length of time, that we sometimes kind of get very entrained with that. That in fact these things take time, that the amounts of money, the amounts of effort between useful milestones is going to vary between a kind of a lean startup where you could do something in a month versus something, the deeper the tech, probably the longer the gap. So giving people both the education and the support and the community that they need, as well as that sort of insight into what it means to de-risk. And then there's access to infrastructure. I mean, after you mentioned kind of expensive equipment, microscopes and fabs and, what have you. And I think this ability to sort of make chips and do whatever we need to do at the cutting edge is so important, because it's incredibly expensive to replicate.
Exactly.
The idea that we can get access, and I know in Singapore you think a lot about that with SG Innovate and elsewhere. And so I think that there are, framing it that way and thinking about how we provide resources, inspiration, and also reduce frictions along those milestones, I think is a really helpful framework that then allows us to run multiple programs, and the clever teams just make use of all of them, don't they? In the ecosystem, they kind of seamlessly draw those resources in. And that's a really good situation.
And if I may add one more thing, Francis, just to build on what Fiona said, and this is really brings in some of the key ecosystem partners like QRDI, for example. So the idea of training researchers in being more entrepreneurial and innovative is, in fact, we're thinking of bringing this upstream before the researchers have actually written their proposal to QRDI, before they've decided what is it they're going to work on. Because let's face it, if you don't have that training as a researcher in engineering or science or healthcare, you're going to think of a technical problem for which you're going to bring a technical solution. And that's going to lead to patenting, it leads to publications in high impact factors and so on. But most of the time, whether it's actually solving societal problem or leading to having an economic potential, is going to be very, very small, if at all. And the idea is that now, if we can actually inspire them and train them on how to use technical solutions to solve real big problems that are going to really have, and those solutions are going to have an impact, we believe it's going to put the research in a different direction, a direction that actually will allow them to still publish some very meaningful papers, to still achieve some very interesting patents, but which are actually going to have a real impact in society and in the economy. And that, I think, is going to be a game changer, because very often if you try to bring a technology that's been patented and is working and try to find a problem for it, you're going to be faced with very poor results. But on the other hand, if you can bring in the problem first and then develop a technology or science that actually is going to be funded by QRDI or the NSF, or then the chances of actually making an impact are much greater, which does not detract from the publication value and the patents and all of those. So we believe those two things are not exclusive, and that doing startups is not a distraction to advancing your career and publishing. In fact, we believe that the impact of those publications will be much greater if they're really solving a real problem in the marketplace and in society.
Okay, thank you. I think the message I'm getting is that although I did ask panelists to identify one or two, but I sense that it's difficult to do so, and that's not because they try not to upset anybody, I think, but rather that actually in this business, it's really about an ecosystem, right? There has to be multiple pieces in place. So you should have many different paths and many different sort of programs that can help. I thought I'll share a little bit about a program undertaken by NUS, which I think has really it's different from the regular venture building and all that. Right? It's an internship program. I don't know whether you have heard of it, but NUS started this internship program called NOC, NUS Overseas College, 20 years ago. So it started as an experiment, and then it picked up momentum. So it's now quite a large program. So essentially, it is attaching undergrads in the second, third year, right after they had a couple of years at university, for up to a year in startups across the world, in entrepreneur hotspots. Silicon Valley, obviously, New York, London, Shanghai, Beijing. So different places all over the world, and the students get attached there for a year to a startup, and they take classes to the sort of partner universities. I think in Silicon Valley they take classes at Stanford, Shanghai as well. There's a news. So they actually get credits. So it's not a year off without credits. They get credits, so they don't suffer in terms of graduation. And the stats actually are quite amazing. So in 20 years, about 4,000 students have gone through the program, and they've formed 1,000 companies, out of these 4,000. So that's quite good. And even now, 75% of them are involved in startups, over 20 years. So there was a study that was done that says that finds that for somebody who went on this program, a student who went on this program, is 10 times more likely to start a company than somebody who didn't, same cohort. So I was quite impressed with the program, and as a professor, I get to see the difference that the program makes on the students, right? Because you teach the class, some have gone through, some did not, right? So you can immediately see the difference. Those who have gone through are confident, they know how to analyze things, they get straight to the point, So whereas those that have not are really green about this studies. So I thought that's something which is somewhat unique, but I think it is also very effective in terms of building the entrepreneurial mindset among the young students. Okay, let me see whether I want to take a question from the audience. Okay, there's a lot of questions coming in. Okay, a question for Fiona. From your MIT GRIP experience, how do you see the role of university differing from one region to another? You've done that for parts of the world. So what differences do you see?
Yeah, thanks. So this is a program where that we really created a decade ago in response to many people coming to Boston sort of saying, we want an ecosystem like Kendall Square. And depending on who was in their office that day and who they met, they might go back with sort of a view of one singular program or a set of activities or a building, and sort of assume that if we could just replicate that, we would be fine. When I think we all know, and we've all used this word ecosystem, that it is about the coming together of multiple stakeholders around particular areas of both sort of comparative advantage and specialization, and focus for a particular region. And so when we created the program, it was to try to sort of bring stakeholders together from different regions and work with them. And we've been fortunate enough to work actually with Qatar very long time ago now, with Singapore. We were just working with a team from Rio just a few weeks ago. I think my experience is that, so we will say that we think we want to go beyond triple helix to sort of recognize we need 5 stakeholders at the table: universities, entrepreneurs, risk capital, large corporations, and the government. We need collective action on the part of those 5 stakeholders, but we often find that universities make very, very powerful champions for a region. They often have the name of the region in the name, and so they are very committed to place, just as obviously we see with Qatar University. And they can often be seen as kind of honest brokers, if you like. I mean, there are a few places in the world where I think that has been hard, where the university is perhaps, so committed to the idea of its kind of research and traditional sort of framing of its research and education goals. That this idea that contributions to the economy and to solving big problems and to being a little more, let's call it practical, a little less ivory tower, remains challenging. So I think that's one failure mode that makes it hard for those universities to kind of get out of their own way. I think it is hard if the university sort of thinks it can do everything and perhaps doesn't create the space for the other participants to kind of come to the table. I've seen some really interesting work in places. I mean, one of my favorite is in Nova Scotia. University there, Dalhousie, has been really excellent in saying, our comparative advantage is in solving sort of problems around oceans. So not narrow in fisheries or shipbuilding, but sort of oceans more broadly, and have tried to sort of do some specialization and support in that area. So I think we've seen that. One of the tensions, I think, is that universities tend to think of themselves as specialized by department, but having to be good and educate across the board. That we've always thought about universities having to have a department of everything, one of each, and that entrepreneurship and a lot of the support for innovation entrepreneurship often probably needs to be a little more focused. And I think there's an interesting tension there that we sometimes kind of confront, as well as a tension in how do we incorporate people with deep entrepreneurial experience into our faculties. So again, I see some tensions there. But in general, I think universities are absolutely critical to building effective ecosystems.
Okay. There's a question here that asks, is there too much pressure on the universities to have economic societal impact? This which may lead them to have less focus on the education and research, right? The sort of traditional role of universities. Are we asking too much of the university? What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, are we asking too much? I mean, it kind of, I see a lot of the work we do is a natural output of like the activities we undertake and the caliber of the people that we recruit, that they kind of are inquisitive and creative, and they want to kind of explore new things, and they want to undertake new missions and journeys. So I kind of see it as a natural corollary of kind of the core traditional mission of the university. I know certainly when the Enterprise Lab was formed sort of 6 or 7 years ago, there was this apparently, and I joined sort of shortly afterwards, but there was a sort of pre-formation debate around, isn't this sort of, aren't we going to distract our students? They're just here to get good degrees. And if anything, I think that like 6, 7 years later, we're now trumpeted as like, one of the reasons to come to Imperial, because it's what the students are asking for. The students want to get a brilliant technical degree. They also want to meet really interesting people. They want to pursue their own ideas. So I kind of see it as I see it more of an evolution rather than kind of an imposition. It's not something I ever really row up against in my day-to-day life of like, oh, this feels like we're trying to stretch the university out of shape here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
If I may add to that a little bit, Francis, I would go much further. I would say that if universities don't bring in innovation, entrepreneurship, and now sustainability training to their students, we would be failing those students. So I think we have to make it really a core mission. And because let's face it, we're training students for unemployment. Only 5% of PhDs actually have a chance of getting a tenure track position. What's happening to the other 95%? They were trained in a very narrow, very specialized field without knowing anything else, with the sole purpose of publishing 5 or 6 papers and writing a thesis. No social skills, no humanities, no business skills, no idea of how the actual outside world works or what are the grand challenges that they're going to be facing. So if we don't train them, and also, let's face it also, who is creating the new jobs? It's the startups. It's not the established old companies. And so this model of specialization still has its place. I'm not saying that we should get rid of it, but we need to start thinking of, like Fiona said, of humanity, of humanizing the technologies and the sciences and digitizing the humanities as well, creating multidisciplinary programs. Because why are those students coming to universities? They're not coming to be taught some theoretical knowledge and doing some research that's going to have zero impact. They're coming there to be able to get a job. And if we don't train them to get a job in those startups, one thing that lots of people I think don't realize in Silicon Valley is that Silicon Valley is not only a place that actually grooms entrepreneurs, successful startups. It also prepares the talent that's going to work for those startups. No founder is going to be successful by being a great founder with a great project and a great core team. They need the talent, the hundreds and sometimes thousands of employees who can code in the morning and do marketing in the afternoon and sweep the floor in the evening and work for stock options, because that's how they're going to be successful. The traditional ways of teaching and training our students is not to work for those kind of companies. So this is why I'm saying that not only do we need to have entrepreneurship program, but we need to embed entrepreneurship and innovation and sustainable development across all disciplines in a way that prepares those young kids to actually be successful in the marketplace and have an impact. And if we don't do it, we're failing them. And and universities therefore needs to reorganize and renew themselves to be able to actually take care of their core mission, which is essentially to train those kids to be successful, successful participants in the society.
So what you say actually was also put up as a question, right? The question is, as education goes through fundamental change, can entrepreneurship participation also be core to establishing, to emerging education? So, should entrepreneurship education become core? Almost like what? Science.
I think you've heard my answer there. Yes.
Maybe I can. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think entrepreneurship education sort of narrowly defined, like how do you start a company? I think we need to educate our students at every stage, whether it be undergrads, the PhDs that, as Lofty says, most of them won't become professors. And frankly, even if they are, right, you sort of think recursively, we need them to do this as well. I think we have to have people understand the paths to impact. And so, what does it mean to turn something that you have sort of as a concept into something that can actually be used by, hundreds of companies, millions of people? And that's a combination of skills, some of which are quite technical and some of which require leadership and some of which require an appreciation of team building, fundraising. And so I think that there's a sort of set of skills and an appreciation for understanding the problems in the world. So these challenges that both of my colleagues have talked about, as have you, Francis. And so I think there's a set of things, and we can probably do that in a variety of ways. And frankly, I think we also have to talk to our students about sort of ethics and and kind of many of those topics, because I think otherwise it's also very, very easy for people to just sort of leave and assume that all this is easy. We raise money and then, we end up going down slippery slopes of sort of fraud and so on. And so I do think there's a whole set of things that cause our students to be more effective humans when they go out into the working world that we probably need to continue to think harder about. And entrepreneurship for me is a piece of that slightly bigger puzzle.
I'd agree with that. I definitely don't think it's helpful to narrowly define entrepreneurship education around how to set up a business. I certainly don't think we're going to change the world by making every student do that. Probably going to sort of devalue the student experience. I tend to, it's around agency. It's how you take a broadly speaking a concept and how you teach someone the skills to think for themselves, to work out how they can make that sustainable and real. I think there's a critical core skills, regardless of whether or not you're going to form a startup. And let's be honest, like most startups fail. So it's not like it's a route to untold riches. I mean, yes, some succeed and succeed spectacularly well, but I think the core skill set is around, no, you have agency, you can make a difference. And, even if you're going to go and work in a traditional industry, you can still apply this mindset. And by applying that mindset, actually, you're making yourself more employable. You're going to make yourself a more effective employee. So I like to look at entrepreneurship quite broadly, rather than just, no, it's just about the sort of mechanics of how one forms a business.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, our time is coming up, but I'd like to ask a question, which is, I'm going to listen to what the panel has to say, right? Now, with all this, startup companies is becoming quite sexy, right? A lot of students just want to get involved. And of course, when the students get involved, it could affect their grades. They may not even be able to graduate, right? If they, spend all the time doing the startup project instead of the classes, or they may even decide to drop out of school altogether. So I wonder if you professors have encountered that kind of situation. What would be your advice to students who are suffering in their grades or who wants to drop out of school to pursue, the startup idea, knowing that, as Ben said, most startups fail?
I have the classic, I get the, so why do you want to, what's driving you? Why do you want to do this? I want to make lots of money. Well, then don't do. I recommend that you don't do this course. There are easier ways to make money. It's one of these questions, and it goes back to that comment I was making around like the fear that by students doing this, that it's going to distract them. I've not come across a single instance in the last 6 years at Imperial, or even before that, where it's ever been that kind of binary decision between, I'm going to stop doing my degree program and do something else. I think if you play the averages, I would always say, well, actually, no. I mean, you'll spend a lot of money. You'll get the degree program. Like, so it's very rare that it resorts to such a binary decision, like a 0 or a 1, that actually you can still get your degree and you can still develop your idea. It may be that you have to retime things or schedule things differently. I would always recommend to get if you've started, you may as well get the degree, because like the chances are if this doesn't work out, at least you've got that kind of degree program behind you. So I think it's one of those things that people fear, but then like students don't just spend their lives studying. They do a whole range of extracurricular activities. They go out partying at weekends. It's not like, they're not doing other things anyway. So I think I find that a slightly simplistic way of kind of, it's got to be all entrepreneurship or all education. It's kind of like a false binary, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's our job to try to bring in entrepreneurship and innovation education as an enhancement to their education experience rather than a distraction or a competitor. And I believe we can do so by proper guidance and proper timing of the courses and the activities and so on, so that they don't go all one way, like Ben said. And I have the similar experience, is that the one that succeeded did not have to give up their degrees, although in one case we had to really bend backward to allow them to complete their degree. It was a master's degree in this case, because they were extremely busy with their startup, and they just raised $25 million. This is the startup in Canada that took our master's degree. One form of that kind of enhancement, this is something that we did at McMaster University, which was essentially to develop an innovation minor that would allow them essentially to get the innovation minor to start their company, to use their senior design project essentially towards pushing forward with their startup. And then for those that were not funded, they essentially, their senior design project was to work for those startups that got funded. So it provided, instead of doing an internship with a company where they just get a desk job and for social responsibility, they actually had to contribute to the development of that startup, whether in the business side or the technical side. And it was an innovation minor that got humongous success. I mean, we had 1,600 registrations in year 2 of the program for all of the faculties. And we timed it so that it was by the 3rd year of their bachelor's degree that they apply for funding. And by the 4th and 5th year, this is when they starting really going into product development and business development and all those things. And so that by the 5th year, if they're engineers, or the 4th year, if they're all the disciplines are bachelors, they would be able to exit essentially with either having developed the startup or founded the startup, or working for that same startup that their classmates have started. And one thing that I would like to add here, we're not suggesting that entrepreneurship education should be for founders. We're suggesting that entrepreneurship education should be for all, so that the founders are able to recruit the kind of entrepreneurial talent that they need, and that those students essentially will be able to also be employable by those startups that they learned about how to actually work for a startup. So that entrepreneurial spirit, I think, is important, that it be every student or most students be exposed to it, so that they understand what are it enhances essentially their employability for whatever company they go to. Because if you have an entrepreneurial spirit, you can work very well for a startup, or you can work extremely well for an established company as well. And so that's really the idea here of what I mean by entrepreneurship education for all.
Okay, thank you. That's very good. Maybe a final question, because we have to wrap it up soon. Running your various programs, do you have KPIs? Do you have what do you measure as a measure of success? Do you have that at all, or you don't?
Yes. So many KPIs. So what are the things we measure? So the input measures, so how many people apply for programs, attend events. I mean, it's a fairly blunt, but at least you're getting a sense of the kind of throughput measure. So you can do things around how people assess their knowledge, or their sort of understanding of a concept pre and post program. There's also some really interesting tool that's been developed by KTH in Stockholm in Sweden, which is like an innovation readiness level. So you can track how far the venture idea develops. That's really interesting. And then the classic output measures, and these are the measures that tend to get plastered on your website and on reports, which is how many people employed, how many, how much, what funding's been raised, how many startups have you formed. So, and I think that's part of the problem, because we tend to, and we do it as well, we tend to focus on that stuff. But in actual fact, we don't classify ourselves as like a kind of startup organization. Our mission isn't to create startups. Our mission is to inspire and upskill these amazing individuals. And if we do that at scale, you're going to see these really fantastic entrepreneurial outputs. But we have a collection of measures, but broadly speaking, measure the stuff coming in, measure what difference we're making as you go through it, and then measure what you end up with at the end of the day. I've never come across a university that's properly resourced in terms of being able to collect the data as systematically as you might want to collect the data over the kinds of timeframes that you need to collect the data as well.
Yeah. Can I just underscore that? So I think so somebody said to me, how many startups does MIT have? I can measure the number that come through the technology licensing office, because that's a very well collected, well-defined object. I can sort of measure any given program, how many people participated in our accelerator. I can measure how many students are in the classroom. But because of the point that both Lottie and Ben made about the fact that the really effective sort of teams use all these things, we do endless amounts of double counting. There's all kinds of and then I've done this as well. We survey our alum so we can create all sorts of interesting statistics about what they've done later. But it's an absolute mess. Right. And so I think that there is a project to be done across a number of our institutions, potentially, collectively coming to some agreements and seeing whether we can be a bit more systematic. Because I think this point that we have to measure things along these milestones, both for individuals and for projects, is incredibly important. And I do think we have to remember that, we're not a fund and we're not an accelerator. So our job is not to necessarily create n number of companies for sort of, X amount of money put in. We are really in the business of thinking about how we give people the skills and knowledge they need to be successful over their lifetime. And yet, for me, again, the Dawn-based sort of side, that is all about right. But when it comes to the lab-based stuff, I think we do need to sort of ask, how is this research and effort having an impact in the world? And the startup is an important piece of that, but it's by no means the only piece. And so I think we continue to have somewhat blunt measures, but my main frustration is less about the bluntness and more about just the messiness. And I keep sort of hoping that we could do something about that collectively, so we could sort of compare notes. So that's a bit of a plea across a group of us, if possible.
I strongly agree. And we spend our lives discovering just when we think we've counted everything, we spend our lives discovering startups.
Yeah,
because it's messy.
Yeah, so we have two slight advantages here. One of them that was mentioned by Fiona is that we're starting on a blank slate. So we don't have that messy legacy, which is amazing, by the way, for you guys to deal with in terms of KPIs, exactly. The second one is that the Office of Strategic Innovation, Entrepreneurship, and Economic Development sits directly under the president. So we are kind of an umbrella organization that's in charge now of innovation, entrepreneurship, and economic development as this fourth or third pillar. So our KPIs, we started essentially explicitly splitting them out, and we have two groups of APIs. We have the output KPIs that Ben mentioned. We also have the outcomes or the impact KPIs, which are much harder to measure, but because we're planning ahead and we're trying to build kind of the structure. So this led us to really change our registration process, create exit interviews, take a lot of surveys and so on. And it's going to get harder and harder and messier, but we're definitely very conscious. And like Ben said, we're going to be discovering more things as we go and try to catch them. But I think the fact that we're starting on a blank slate and trying to think ahead and plan ahead and consciously design this ecosystem, we're hopeful we're going to keep things under control, at least for a while.
Okay, thanks very much. We have to bring the webinar to a close. It's coming to the end of the time. For the audience, I'm sorry we can't answer all the questions. There's lots of questions. Unfortunately, our time is limited. But we would really appreciate if you would take 1 minute, just 1 minute, to give us your feedback on the seminar. There's a link in the chat box that you could click on, and it's just a few questions that would not take more than a minute. So please give us your feedback on the seminar and also suggestions on how we can improve. So maybe to end off, maybe a final word from each panelist. What this is about, the role of university. So I guess, by the selection of the panelists, there's unanimous agreement about about the importance of the role that universities play, right, in providing entrepreneurship education. Not so much to create companies, but to inspire and upskill the students, right, so that they can make an impact, or they are more ready, more prepared, equipped to make an impact in society, right? And right. Create a unicorn in the process. That's a bonus, but it is really the path to impact that we want to show the students. So maybe a final word from each one about your advice, or maybe your thought about how this process, right, which is messy, how it could be improved. I mean, where should we pay attention to doing certain things better in terms of imparting entrepreneurial knowledge or developing tech entrepreneurs in the university. We start from Lotfi.
Sure. I think my final word is that I think we're tech entrepreneurship is a complex science that we're still trying to figure out, just like sustainability is a complex science. And it's complex from my perspective as a physicist, as essentially it's a strongly coupled system of a lot of interacting disciplines, technology, market, business, legal, governance, a lot of other disciplines that we teach as separate, but they all are very strongly coupled in making a startup successful. And I don't think today we have a clear understanding of that science and therefore how to actually teach it and how to impart it to future generations. So this is my parting word, is that we need to work together to continue to develop that science that will hopefully emerge and lead to a better method on how to teach entrepreneurship, make it less prone to failure as it is today, and essentially be able to mitigate or reduce the amount of mortality that we see, and make it less risky and less uncertain. And I think that's an endeavor that's worth going after for any researcher or any scientist around the world.
And Ben? Oh, sorry, Ben. Oh, you're still here. Okay. Last minute.
So what Lofty said, I completely agree with all of that. I have to rush off, I'm afraid. So.
Okay, thanks very much for joining us.
It's been great sharing being part of this webinar and sharing the stage with two incredible speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Likewise.
And final word to Dame Fiona.
Sure. Look, I think there are a lot of things that we need to do. I think the thing I would put front and center is the really important challenges that our world faces, and making sure that we put those challenges and opportunities in front of our university communities, because I think that is what galvanizes the energy and attention. I think then this whole idea of structuring what we do around some of these milestones is a very powerful idea, and actually just helps bring structure and some organization. Recognizing that we need to focus not just on the projects, but also on the people and the teams. And the last thing I'd say is I do think we have to bring our faculty along on this journey. I think our students are way out ahead of us. They are driving this train. And I think occasionally the faculty rightly are saying this is something very new. And so we need to, I think, bring our faculty along on this journey, because they're incredibly important partners in this. And so while the senior leadership of our universities and our students think this is essential, I think that there's just work that we have to do as advocates, and to make sure that we put the science behind it, as Lofty says, and recognize that this is not necessarily a trade-off in terms of the quality of the work that we collectively do in our institutions.
Thank you. Okay. Right, thank you, panelists, Dr. Lofty, Fiona, and Ben, right, who's left first. Okay, and for the participants, thank you very much for joining us. I hope you find the discussion stimulating, and we'll see you next time at the next seminar. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Fiona. Yeah, Francis.
Bye-bye.
It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.